well-known veterans, let me call them, whom every PhD student and others know have read in English, and of course, originally in Arabic and French, because most have been translated. So, the four panelists I have are from this generation of researchers. Two come from English departments like me, and two from history departments, two American and two Moroccan. So, as I said, I'm not going to spend too much time, even if they brought to me the bios. You have them, they're printed in your programs. And as I said, Graham Cornwell is going to be the first speaker, and he's going to be followed by Khalid Shawsh? Yes, he's going to be followed by Khalid Shawsh. Graham Cornwell is from George Washington University, Khalid Shawsh from Moulay Slimane University in the city of Beni Mellal, one of the new universities. And then we'll have my good friend Karim Bejit, who has been and is in the city of Casablanca and Bemsik University. And sometimes I make a mistake because his twin brother, also an academic, and very often we find ourselves in the same panels and so on. And then we end with our final panelist, Stacey Holden, who will speak to us about Edith Wharton. So we have a mix of literature and history, and actually history is one of those fields in which can use and relies on so many other fields, including music, everything. You can put history to it, and then it becomes a legitimate source of knowledge, of historical knowledge. At the same time, we, from literature, can read stuff. And a lot of literature is also historical and cannot make sense without history. So without further ado, I give the floor to the first speaker, Graham Cornwell. You have the floor.
The green button, okay. Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here. I'm honored to, and a little nervous to be the first speaker of this conference. In particular, thank you to Dr. Kenbib. I sense that there are lots of people behind the scenes putting on this lovely conference in this incredibly beautiful building, and I'm very grateful, and particularly to Hafsa for her help. Before I get started, I just wanted to share that in addition to the biography you see in the program, I'm actually also the director of the Moroccan American Studies Initiative. This is a new initiative just launched this week. You can go to MoroccanAmericanStudies.com and find interviews, podcasts, essays, actually with my fellow panelists today, talking about the history of Morocco-U.S. relations. So I encourage you to do that. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. Why are Morocco and the U.S. friends? Why are they such good friends? This is the kind of historical question that we're, I think, asking in these next couple days. I have a 7-year-old son, and I've watched him explore new activities, trying to become friends with different types of kids, playing soccer with some, climbing trees, playing with Pokemon cards. And I wonder, why is he friends with this person, or why is he friends with that person? And I think the real answer is that there's no real answer, that friends are friends that we meet and we find that our comportment and our demeanor just works with each other. And I think that that's the case with U.S. and Morocco. There's some explained factors, but it's not always so clear. But the fact is that we just get along. Okay, what I want to do this morning is to take a very brief episode in the American Civil War and zoom out to discuss what it says about Morocco-U.S. relations and about how the Civil War really mattered in Morocco, the American Civil War really mattered in Morocco and beyond as a global war. Okay, so to start, let's do like a little historical imagining. You can close your eyes if you want to, you don't have to. The year is 1862. We're in Tangier. We feel the breeze coming off the strait. And of course, Tangier is a relatively cosmopolitan city. It's Morocco's diplomatic capital. It's an important trade city. By Moroccan standards, it's a large port city, but really only by Moroccan standards. It's much smaller than other Mediterranean ports of the mid and late 19th century, places like Marseille, Genoa, Tunis, Algiers, Alexandria. It's much smaller than those places. There's a sizable foreign resident community, but it's sizable, but it's small enough where they still know each other very well. All right, there are intimate ties among the expatriate, particularly the European resident community. Sorry, I'm gonna just.
You removed the.
Just take the plug. There we go. Okay, you can still hear me. Okay. It's 1862, of course, and so a few major changes have just happened. I'm sure all of you know about these. Of course, the new trade agreements with foreign powers like Great Britain starting in 1856, making foreign trade much more profitable for European as well as Moroccan merchants. At the same time, Morocco, coming off a catastrophic military defeat to Spain in 1860 that comes with reparations, for which Morocco takes out loans and goes into debt. And so the increase in trade, especially imports into Morocco, benefits not just European merchants, but also the Moroccan state. Those increased customs duties are theoretically helping them pay off their debt. And this is the moment when things like tea and sugar become important commodities, things that we start to see Moroccans become tea drinkers after the 1860s. But what is the single most important good in Morocco in terms of this trade in the early 1860s, in 1862, where I'm starting this story? It's cotton. Specifically, cotton textiles manufactured in the mills of Lancashire using cotton grown by enslaved labor from the American South. All right, let's keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, again, it's winter 1862. Across the ocean, the Civil War is raging, the American Civil War. Union troops have invaded the South and occupied key Confederate rebel forts in what we now call the West. That would be like Tennessee and Kentucky. Jefferson Davis has recently been inaugurated as the first president of the Confederate States. The very first naval battle in the world between two ironclad ships takes place off the coast of Virginia. And it's right now, this time of year, that James DeLong arrives as the new U.S. consul to Morocco. Who is James DeLong? James DeLong is in Morocco for a very short amount of time, but he's the center of this story that I'm trying to tell today. DeLong was a judge in Ohio. He got the job after developing a reputation as a staunch anti-slavery advocate. He presides over a very famous case in 1854 where he effectively confiscates two young boy slaves being transported through Ohio as sort of almost as contraband, and he frees them and takes them from their southern slave owner. But he is actually Lincoln's second choice for the job. When he comes to Tangier, he has never left the United States. As far as I know, he's never even left the state of Ohio. He has no diplomatic experience. He speaks no foreign languages. He gets to his post, and within the first couple days, he writes to his the American consul in Gibraltar, his counterpart, a man by the name of Horatio Sprague, who's maybe well known to some historians of the period, who is very influential in the region during the time. And he writes to them, and what he says, in effect, is, I've made it to Tangier, I'm excited to be here, and I cannot wait to fight the Confederates wherever I find them. And the consul in Gibraltar replies and says, well, okay, that's great, but you're in Tangier, Morocco. You're not going to find any Confederate rebels here in Tangier, Morocco. And while that's true, in this period, in the early, during the war, there are Confederate ships that occasionally cruise near the coast of North Africa or the Iberian Peninsula, and there are certainly Union ships that are patrolling all the time to try to catch up with them. But of course, still unlikely that he's going to find Confederates in Tangier. Of course, what happens? he finds them. 2 weeks later, he's walking down by the old port, and he claims that he hears two southern accents, distinctive southern accents. He somehow identifies these as belonging to Confederate sympathizers that are coming from the Sumter. The Sumter is a naval ship docked in Gibraltar waiting for repairs. It can't get repairs or fuel while in Gibraltar, and so it's sort of been stuck there for weeks, months actually. He gets two Moroccan soldiers. They march down to the port and they arrest these two Confederates. So let's talk for a minute about who these Confederates, who these rebels were. The first is a man named Henry Myers. He's basically the accountant aboard the ship. He's less important. The second is Thomas Tunstall. Thomas Tunstall was the consul in Cadiz prior to the war. He was removed from his post because of his Confederate sympathies. Lincoln knew that he was pro-secession, pro-South, and he removed him from the position. They arrived on a French ship. The plan was to take the ship from Gibraltar to Cadiz in hopes that in Cadiz they could find the fuel and repairs and supplies that the ship needed to get back out to sea, because the American consul in Gibraltar had been very successful in preventing Gibraltar merchants from assisting the ship, sort of insisted that everyone remain neutral and stay out of the conflict by not intervening with this ship that was docked in Gibraltar. So they're trying to make it to Cadiz, and they stop in Tangier halfway on a French ship. The two men get off and go for a walk into town, supposedly to visit a friend of Thomas Tunstall, and that's when they're arrested. They're locked up in chains in the legation. Word eventually spreads around the city, and the next day, hundreds of people, mainly Europeans, gather in the streets, march through the Medina, up to the doors of the legation, start pounding on the doors and yelling. It's not clear if they were armed, but what is clear is DeLong, our consul there, is very threatened. Is threatened by this. Eventually, a few Moroccan guards are able to push back this crowd, and they disperse. But DeLong is very offended. He's appalled by this behavior. He blames European consuls for sort of riling up, for fomenting a riot, a rebellion. And he sends letters, very undiplomatic letters. He has very little sort of sense of tact and etiquette to every single European consul, including the Swedish one, basically accusing them of starting this riot. So Mohammed Bargash, the Niab at the time, gets word of this, and he orders their release. But DeLong goes to him, pushes back, and basically refuses, and Bargash relents. He allows DeLong to call for U.S. Marines. 40 U.S. Marines land in Tangier. They march up the hill at the sort of, what would that be, the south side of the Medina, kind of, and into the legation. They take the two prisoners. They escort them with their guns drawn back down the hill onto a ship, and eventually to a military prison in Massachusetts. For DeLong's part, several countries complain about this. They complain first about the arrest itself, but second about DeLong's response. And they go straight to Bargash, and they go straight to President Lincoln with their complaints. DeLong remains adamant that he was in the right, and that even though these two Confederates arrived on a French boat, they were American subjects and under his jurisdiction. So what's going on here? This is sort of the episode. It's brief, but I think it contains a lot of interesting details about what's happening in Morocco at the time. And there are three things that I want to point out. First, it shows us why the war matters in Morocco, why the civil war matters in Morocco. Because the makeup of Tangier's population at the time, its European population, was predominantly mercantile, related to trade. They're very aware of how the war is affecting business. They're aware that that the end or the lack of supply of cheap cotton produced by slave labor in the American South is going to have a serious impact on the number one good that they trade, which is cotton textiles coming from Manchester in England. There's an idea that the city of Liverpool is the most pro-Confederate city in the entire world during the war because of the wealth, where the wealth of the city comes from, specifically this trade in cotton textiles that pass through the port of Liverpool. And I'm not suggesting that Tangier is the second most or anything, but it's clear that this population is very engaged and very economically invested in the South and their victory. The second way I think that we see how the war, what we can draw from this episode, is just the idea of protections and protégés. Of course, they sort of reaches their peak in the late 19th century, but it's definitely happening now too in the 1860s. Who was under whose jurisdiction? We see in this episode the American consul is claiming these two rebels under his jurisdiction. However, the French also claim that by arriving on a French ship, they're under their legal jurisdiction. They are under French protections, and that kind of brings me to my third point, which is a comparison between what's happening in Gibraltar and what's happening in Tangier at the exact same time. How international law does not apply equally across these two spaces that are so geographically close together. So on one hand, in Gibraltar, we have the American consul able to keep a Confederate ship in port without any repairs or fuel, in part because he plays upon the notion of neutrality, of European neutrality in the war. No European powers ever take a side. They sometimes explore the idea of joining the South or supporting the South, the Confederacy, but they remain neutral throughout. So he's able to sort of say, you must remain neutral, you cannot help this ship. There's no such thing in Morocco. Morocco is not neutral. It is never neutral. In fact, after this episode, Morocco sort of declares the strength of its friendship for the Union. It promises, as I think Dr. Kambib mentioned yesterday, it promises to arrest any Confederates that they find after this moment. It promises to alert the United States of any Confederate cruisers and Confederate ships that it sees or knows about in the vicinity of Morocco. The friendship is strengthened in a way that we don't see with European powers. We don't see really any country make a declaration of friendship, of allyship. I'm not sure of alliance quite as strong as we do with Morocco during the war. But it's partly because of that erosion of Moroccan sovereignty, this idea of protections, that people can be protected. Foreign subjects are not subject to Moroccan law, but rather under the jurisdiction of their consul, that DeLong is able to do this. This is unthinkable. If the American consul in Cadiz or in Gibraltar had tried to arrest these two men, it would have been a huge outcry, a huge diplomatic mistake, and a serious conflict between Spain and the U.S. or between Britain and the U.S. But here in Morocco, because consuls have this sort of legal jurisdiction of protections where they can reach out and claim that that sort of legal authority over their own subjects, DeLong can do this. He can make this arrest in Morocco, something that he could never have done in Gibraltar. So the Moroccan government, again, like I said, later writes to Washington to sort of emphasize the strength of this friendship, its willingness to side with the United States, the Union against the rebels, to prohibit Confederate ships from docking in its ports. And I think even though that sort of future situation of more Confederates coming to Morocco is unlikely, It's a bold declaration of U.S.-Moroccan friendship. And we see these moments, and I hope that we talk about them more, where the friendship is tested or the relationship is tested and always emerges steady, you know? Our interests don't always perfectly overlap, but it's been a stable relationship for hundreds of years now, which I think is sort of interesting. You know, just to say something about DeLong, because he was American consul, so he's removed from his position. He's never approved by the Senate. He only spends a few months as consul in Tangier. He's actually eventually placed in another consul role in the Caribbean, where he does the exact same thing. He arrests he arrests a handful of Confederates there, and that are coming aboard a Spanish ship, and creates another sort of diplomatic headache for Lincoln. You know, I hope that this is a reminder that the Civil War was not just chronologically parallel to Western imperialism. Sometimes we think, especially coming from the American perspective, that we have this discrete narrative that is sort of outside of what is happening with European imperial expansion into Africa, in particular the Middle East, maybe. But it's not just parallel to those things. It's really a part of it. I mean, especially through the cotton trade, it plays a critical role in the expansion of imperialism, whether that's through the sorts of ports and markets that are opening up to new trade in these cotton textiles, or the creation of new spaces of production and European powers needing to find new places to grow cotton. So, you know, it's truly a global civil war, and I think this episode here in Morocco highlights that. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Graham, for stopping on the second that I would have stopped you. It's rare, I can tell you. There's also, I spoke about disciplines feeding on other disciplines. There's another field that likes to feed on history, and that's cinema. And obviously, if any one of you here is a writer of scenarios, maybe one story based on this very sharp incident could be a good movie.
I thought that's like the only way for me to make a fortune is probably to turn this into a script for
Great.
Netflix or something.
Okay, the next speaker is Khalid Shawush, as I said, from Benin.